You're not. You're hearing me, but you're not actually listening. About this, feel like
Do you
I'm
even
carrying
care
the
about
weight of
how
this
it
whole
feels?
relationship.
70% of relationship-centered media, including books, movies, and TV shows, cater to a woman's perceptions and desires. But at what point does it become important to ask, what do men want? And while the curiosity and empowerment of women continues to rise with praise, it also seems to continue to surface itself at the consequence of diminishing men. And we all eat it up, subconsciously programming ourselves to see men as inadequate. Why would we need to understand them? Now, if it's not obvious, I'm not a man. So you might be wondering, what is a woman doing creating a video on this topic? Well, I pulled my audience across multiple social media platforms, and I directly asked them, what is it that women do not understand about men? So on that note, here are 40 things that men wish women would understand about them. Which brings me to my first point. Learn when to shut up. Now, this might seem really harsh, but men value solutions over venting. Excessive talking without purpose feels overwhelming and somewhat counterproductive. Now, men are wired to be solution-focused. So when women come in without clear communication about what it is that they actually want, the logical side of a male's brain will take over and offer a solution to the problems that they're presenting. And as a consequence to this, women tend to get defensive, frustrated, feeling misunderstood, and ultimately tell men that they simply aren't listening, when in fact, they are. But they are wired to solve problems versus ruminating on them. Alternatively, when a man is making a point, women can become combative and amplify negative emotion and further conflict, which only continues to build up tension between the two. There are situations where it is more important to seek understanding than being right, and this means knowing when to respect their opinion. And no, this doesn't mean completely diminish your own. And this brings me to my next point. Never belittle or disrespect a man. Men value respect much more than adoration or love. And women tend to be much more passive-aggressive, and this is because they are also, on average, much more agreeable. So instead of addressing issues head-on, they tend to make side comments towards their partner. And when they do this, especially in front of other people, it's somehow supposed to just be okay. And when they take it too far and they're called out on their bad behavior, they tend to respond with, oh, come on, it's just a joke. Meanwhile, if their partner were to make a similar comment that they found offensive in front of a group of people, it's just a joke, probably wouldn't fly. And research indicates that respect is the most important factor when it comes to men in relationships. So disrespectful jokes or belittling remarks can impact the quality of the relationship and how long it actually lasts. And alongside this, well, they had some other important points to note, such as, you are not a princess, just a person. Men do appreciate a level of humility, where a sense of entitlement comes off as selfish and demanding. And a comment from my audience made this point directly. I think the biggest misunderstanding is that when a guy does things that you ask him to, it's because he loves you, not because you control him. I guarantee the second that you make him stop loving you, he's gonna tell you to take a walk when you tell him to do things that you brag to all of your friends about. You aren't a mastermind chess-level manipulator. He just cares about you. And this is an important point that I don't want to overlook. Women tend to focus on what they need from a man. Provision, protection, support. And if she doesn't get her needs met, her demands fulfilled, or constant attention, she can become entitled and say things like, a real man would treat his girl like a princess. And yes, I've seen this. But at what point do women start to ask men what they want, what they need, or what they desire? Men are expected to service women, but are women held to the same standards? Why is this such a double standard? And even making this video, along with other men's issues-focused topics, many men don't trust that I actually give a fuck about their problems. And I get it. Women seem to never ask or genuinely care about what men want, and seem to only focus on what they can get from them. And this brings me to my next point. Act, dress, and talk like a lady. There's an inherent expectation for men and women to present themselves with dignity and class. And I'd be amiss if I didn't acknowledge that this does vary from culture to culture. But when women don't have respect for themselves, take care of themselves, care about how they present themselves, or become adversarial in public, well, men aren't interested. A lot of people say that men are fearful or intimidated by women, but according to the feedback that I've received from men here, it's not that they're intimidated by women at all, but more so that they know a problem when they see one. When women are lower in agreeableness and present with much more masculine temperament, they see this as a volcano waiting to erupt. And instead of interacting with somebody that they know can cause problems, they avoid it altogether. Does that sound familiar in the context of our current society? Men are biologically wired to seek women who present with class and restraint. It's a subconscious preference that's tied to a man's desire to seek a partner who embodies respect. And this brings me to my next point. And I'm just going to use a direct quote here. "We are not your gal friends. I have a 20-minute limit for being an emotional tampon. After that, speak to your friends or let us solve the problem." End quote. And I feel the point was made pretty clear by this comment. But another perspective I would like to add is the amount of care and understanding that women give men towards their emotions, and the fact that it's alarmingly absent. Women tend to have larger friend groups that they will lean on for support, whereas men, if they want other men, well, they tend to have to seek that out. They also take on the responsibility of a woman's emotions, which means even if they have feelings, one of you, for the sake of both of you, has to remain centered. And while men are wired for solutions, that doesn't mean that they're emotional stones. What it does mean is that they're not necessarily allotted the same time, space, or respect to express or even validate or acknowledge their emotions. And oftentimes, if they have the courage to try, they are emasculated or these things are thrown in their face. Which brings me to my next point. Do not gossip. If you do, you do it about everybody, including him, and he knows that. This all comes down to responsibility. Your partner is an extension of you, meaning that when you think you're getting off because you're talking down about him, you're also, as a consequence, talking about the person that you are. You chose this partner, and if the roles were reversed, I don't think this type of behavior would fly or go away quietly. Gossip doesn't help anyone. Ever. The problems that you have need to be discussed with the person that you have them with, not in public places or around people who only get to hear one side of the story. And this brings me to my next point, and I'm going to just leave the quote here. When you're fat, you're not a 10. You are a 2, only on a good day, if you are lucky. And again, I think I'm just gonna leave that comment there. And as this continues, this may feel more hurtful, but nevertheless, this is my platform to give them a voice, not about my opinions. So, on to the next one. Women who have had more than one sex partner for every 5 years of age are a red flag. Women have always set the standard for sexual experiences, meaning that men will do what they need to do in order to get it. And what they need to do is reflective of the standards that women set for men. And no, this doesn't mean that men don't have standards, but oftentimes it is the female who controls the pace at which this happens. Not universally true, but directionally correct. And as Andrew Tate would say, a woman's job is to protect her innocence. And I do believe a lot of men would likely agree with that statement. And this brings me to my next point. Learn at least a little bit about the things that he likes. And this is so that at a bare minimum, you can engage in conversation around those things. And in their words, not sound like a complete moron, or engage in those activities without looking like a complete idiot, end quote. The point of this all is that men actually tend to bond through teaching or experiencing or going through activities. Creating things, building things, solving problems, etc. It's simply the act of doing or engaging in something. So it's important for longevity and the depth of the connection that you can have to actually have some type of interest in what he's interested in. As I can almost guarantee that he probably doesn't love sitting down and watching your reality TV shows, but he'll do it with you because he cares. And next on the list, and I think this one's actually pretty important, men do not see or understand hints. And they don't misunderstand you on purpose. They often don't understand your behavior, period. Especially when it fluctuates and jumps from emotion to emotion. If you want something, ask for it. It's not the case, oftentimes, that they actually want to piss you off or frustrate you. It's that they actually don't know what you want them to do. And when it comes to men and women in relationships or dating, they'd like you to understand that you getting a guy is much easier than them getting a woman. And to back this point, I will say social media and dating apps absolutely support this with the data that we have. Men will get one match per 40 swipes on average, where women will get one match for every 2 swipes on average. And speaking of social media and attraction, well, if you focus on your sexuality, you will be judged for your sexuality. There are 3 really important points when it comes to any relationship that actually has depth. And I'm going to break them down here just for simplicity's sake. 1 is the pool of chemistry, which you can have with thousands of people, but that doesn't really make a relationship last. It's what pulls you together, but it isn't really what keeps you there. Connection is a little bit deeper. Things that you enjoy doing, things that you're interested in. It's what creates the next layer of depth in a relationship. But number 3, and the most important piece, is compatibility. And this comes down to values. Where do you want to go? How do you see your life together? What are the things that you find important? And a relationship with chemistry and connection, but without compatibility, it won't last. And sexuality or attraction is only one piece of a relationship. And speaking of attraction, this brings me to my next point. If you give attention to a guy, he will see it as a start. Garnering attention is not the same for men as it is for women. Women tend to get significantly more of it than men do. And as a consequence to that, when a man does receive attention from a woman, he sees this as if you are interested. So advice to women would be, don't lead men on and just be direct. That doesn't mean be rude. And this brings me to my next point, which I really appreciate somebody actually leaving. We don't always understand what we're feeling. Men aren't taught to really process their emotions. And this is something within the domain of what I study in the couples and people that I work with. Men typically present with three things. They're happy, they're horny, or they're angry. But anger is a secondary emotion. It's what they're comfortable with showing. And so just because a man is presenting as angry doesn't mean he's actually angry. And I think giving some grace and seeking understanding is really, really important when it comes to actually cultivating something real with somebody instead of pushing them off like they're an angry man who's reactive and controlling and narcissistic. But I digress. And this brings me to my next point. There's no hidden meaning in our actions or words. Unless the guy does have some type of cluster B personality disorder, men tend to mean what they say and say what they mean. And they will tell you about themselves. Oftentimes what I find is that women don't really like it. For example, if a man says he doesn't want a relationship with you, but he's happy to keep it on the surface, women really struggle to actually accept that to be true, and instead will tell themselves that if they can be good enough and if they're patient, eventually, if they keep giving him what he wants, he will change his mind. And when he doesn't, he's the asshole. What's really important to understand is that he means what he says. If he's not ready or not interested or not in a place where taking the relationship there with you is something that he wants, he will tell you. Again, pending that he's not a narcissist or anybody else that just has really manipulative behaviors. And this brings me to my next point. The things that men and women are attracted to in one another are simply not the same. And to dive deeper on that, well, I'll get to my next point. We don't care about their careers, education, status, or money. And I'll read this as a direct quote. We don't get turned on by how confident they are. Our reaction shifts from not caring to actually being put off. It often comes off as cocky and bombastic. We don't want them to have experience and know what they're doing or expect them to perform. Well, that should be easy to figure out without me being explicit. We're not turned on by how independent they are, no matter how many songs Neo makes. And the problem with this is that it warps the way that they go about dating, since they think that these are legitimately high quality attributes that they have to offer and thus overestimate their own value and pursue the wrong type of man. Many guys express how this makes them feel like women simply do not care, only making distrust and discouragement from dating worse. And this brings me to my next point. Men are not intimidated by women. When it comes to them interacting with other men, if a man oversteps a boundary, violence is very likely, but a decent man would never do that to a woman. If you are argumentative or overstep boundaries, we simply won't deal with you, as the fight part of fight or flight is off the table. And this brings me to my next point. Listening is a two-way street. Many women listen to pop psychology or podcasts and suddenly become relationship experts, using psych language like validate, wounds, trauma, or labels like narcissist or codependent to take the spotlight off of themselves and create rules for thee, but not for me. Women tend to insist on validation, but never validate. They accuse men of not listening while simultaneously interrupting every chance they get. They may go down a path of self-diagnosis with things like ADHD to explain why they can't pay attention or listen to what their partner actually has to say, instead of taking accountability for how their actions might impact how their partner actually feels. And some women can use their children as leverage and then act appalled when they're called out on this really toxic behavior. And this brings me to my next point. When things get toxic, well, men don't want to reject women, oftentimes. Men would rather make themselves unattractive to a woman so that a woman would break up with them, rather than having to break up with her. And as anecdotal experience with some of the men that I've worked with, I can say that this pattern holds true. They will tend to wait until there's a justifiable reason to leave the relationship or act in such a way that pushes the female away to her own breaking point, in which she breaks off. And this brings me to my next point. Stop using exceptions to the rule as points in an argument. Quote, "Stop with your anecdotes. I might say in general that women are shorter than men. And I hear, I know a girl who's 6 feet tall. It's a very annoying way to argue when you know damn well we are right." And I can say I've seen this play out on both sides. But I digress. I can agree that this style of arguing is unnecessary and annoying. And this brings me to my next point, which is insightful coming from a man. What women want and what women say they want are not the same. Today's world is so heavily influenced by faulty modern philosophies, like feminism, that men no longer get to select women who respect, honor, appreciate, or have confidence in men. Instead, we have to choose from the degree of confrontational women that we can accept. Feminist ideas are embedded in even the least feminist type women. They are simply ubiquitous at this point. Meanwhile, people don't even recognize the inherent contradictions, which I do want to highlight here. Women want a good man. They will tell you that he should be emotionally available, while not realizing intrinsically this will actually make him less attractive. Confidence is learned through experience, yet she wants him to be confident as a precondition. She doesn't owe him her confidence, nor respect, nor appreciation, but he should be totally committed to her. Nice guys are ick, but he can't be masculine. She wants the man that all women want, but he has to be faithful to her, even though she still wants women to have sexual freedom, meaning that she can sleep around as much as she'd like, until she decides that the one that she's chosen must now only be with her. But if women are allowed to sleep around, who are they sleeping with? They clearly are choosing not to choose about 70% of men. So this 30% of men or so are supposed to satisfy the sexual freedom of women, but somehow all these women are supposed to be married and committed to by this small pool of 30% of men. So he should, in return, ignore all of his other options for this one woman, even though the odds say that she will leave him when a perceived better option becomes available. And not only that, he must continue to provide for her, even in the aftermath of a divorce. And I'm gonna leave this at the comment. While I do have an alternative perspective, I wanna honor the experience that men are having, not throw my own biases into here. And that brings me to my next point, relative to keeping the peace. Men desire peaceful relationships. The world is inherently competitive. Resources are limited, so men are always in competition with other men, and they look to their relationship for the one place that they can find peace. You need to have peace to regroup, heal, analyze, and just de-stress. And confrontational women are the opposite of peace. So this is why many men want nothing to do with them. And speaking of confrontational, there's toxic people in both genders. That doesn't make masculinity toxic just because some men are toxic. And someone in my audience would say, as to toxic masculinity, there is no such thing. There's masculinity, which women are inherently attracted to, and it's necessary to build and protect our society. And there's femininity, quote, tradwives, not feminists, which men are inherently attracted to. That is also necessary to civilize our society. There's toxic people in both parties. That doesn't make masculinity or just femininity inherently toxic. And this brings me to my next point, speaking of feminism. It doesn't make you attractive to emasculate men. The media does that enough already. Especially if you're a parent. Do you ever notice how men and fathers are constantly depicted as low intelligence, clumsy, and incompetent, with a female lead rushing in to save the day? In mainstream media, Disney movies, and popular family TV shows like Modern Family. And advertisers often portray the male role as incompetent, inadequate, and just overall an idiot, while the female lead comes in and saves the day by being the sensible one who unfortunately has to tolerate all of men's inadequacies. And this brings me to my next point. We like women, not men. So stop being so masculine. I actually asked this commenter to elaborate on what they meant, and here's exactly what they said. It's hard to describe something that I feel on a primal level. However, masculine women who take the leading dominant role in dating, and I don't mean that to be in bed, because men apparently can override this attraction when it comes to their physical attraction to somebody. They tend to start overlooking red flags. And to further the quote, because of this revolution towards masculine women has always overcome my base lust, and I have turned down the advances of women who are way more attractive than me. All of this seems to suggest that there's just something repulsive about overly disagreeable masculine women. And this brings me to my next point. Women always take and never give. Women being the empathetic gender was the biggest lie of the century. Most of the time when you talk about dating or relationships with women, it's always about me. I want, I need, but I never offer, or I do. And that's why men have given up. Why would a man go into a relationship with a woman who can make the same salary as me because equality has been achieved? But I have to give everything and she is expected to give nothing, just to be present. And even if that's a match, the minefield of a woman's psyche is a mystery to men. The amount of game, tantrums, and then one day she doesn't like you anymore, and that's it. You lose half your shit because she doesn't feel love for you anymore, or her female narcissism isn't met by you. And this brings me to my next point pretty nicely. In the short term, men have much more at risk than women do. Entering a relationship represents a significant sacrifice for men. It means sacrificing our finances, independent social life, free time, ease of security, hobbies, and often our emotional and psychological well-being, which is why men tend to be more cautious before jumping into a long-term relationship, whereas the benefits for women are a little bit more obvious on the front end of a relationship. Status, social connection, security, finances, and this means that men will have a longer time horizon to consider whether or not this is worth investing into long term. And women tend to pressure men to become seriously committed within a 2 to 3 month span, whereas in a man's mind, he's thinking a little bit more along the timelines of 6 to 12 months, because from his perspective, he wants to see a longer track record of financial responsibility, respectfulness, emotional stability, and other green flags. And that will give him a lot more confidence to proceed with said woman. And this brings me to my next point. Men tend to be guilty until proven innocent. Many men won't admit this, but they tend to be a little terrified of the consequences of reputation smearing that women tend to do. And for good reason. It can cost them their livelihoods. For women, it seems to be innocent until proven guilty. They're always the victim, not the perpetrator. Whereas men, it seems to be quite the opposite. They are always assumed to be the perpetrator, and inherently always guilty. And this brings me to my next point. Women don't seem to understand how important it is for men to have male friends. Men simply need other men to do men stuff with. No utility, no performance, similar taste in humor, and this can be a place where they feel understood, allowing them to relax, let go, and breathe for a little while. And it seems to be that women don't necessarily understand that men don't really have the same level or number of connections and relationships that they do. And oftentimes women can feel uncomfortable with men having strong male friendships, especially if their male friends tend to engage in behaviors or be single because they assume that their partner will be up to mischief. Fuckery is about. And this brings me to my next point, the double standard on infidelity. If a man steps outside of a relationship, he's pretty much labeled forever. Men are dogs, he will never change. Once a cheater, always a cheater. But when a woman cheats, everybody's interested in understanding her side of the story. The assumption is that women who do cheat were pushed to cheat for some toxic or disrespectful reason. Whereas when men cheat, they're selfish, ego-driven, doing it for their own lust and temptations, instead of honoring and respecting their female counterpart. But is this true? Do men and women ultimately cheat for different reasons? Are women always pushed when they step outside of a relationship? And are men always only doing it to seek their own selfish desires? And this brings me to my next point. Men do have emotions. They're not stones. And if they aren't expressing them to you, well, they simply don't trust you. Men have a lot of fear around expressing their emotions, and this was very adamant in the comment section. Men are not supposed to show emotions or vulnerability because they're seen as weak, and there is a fear that she will lose interest in him if he does. As human beings, we experience the same spectrum of emotions, though society, in many ways, tells men it's not masculine to identify any of your emotions except for anger. This leads a lot of men to be self-destructive or engage passively in suicidal behaviors. And here's another quote that I found really interesting. I really want to share how I believe tons of men are out there experiencing emotions throughout their lives that they don't necessarily know that they're experiencing. To a lot of men, I think a lot of emotions are experienced simply as discomfort, and thus avoided. We are not at all that often taught to engage or how to engage with our emotions. It might be something that most men learn to work with by themselves. My key point here is that men feel more than women think that we do. And I think that that point is incredibly important. And this brings me to my next point. Men and women simply have different motivations for choosing one another. Basically, women need men without desiring them, while men desire women without necessarily needing them. And I quote, Women love animals and children unconditionally, whereas the second a man falls short of his expected utility, or a woman decides she's having a midlife crisis, and her toxic friend group enables her, she can take half of everything and slander his reputation. Men want peace, and women want constant attention, stimulation, and chaos to feel alive. And as a consequence to that, this brings me to my next point. Men are tired in the modern world. Nothing we do is good enough, and even when we work our entire lives to build a business or acquire skills that women are unwilling to, we can have our livelihoods decimated by a woman who decides she no longer wants to be married, or watches the wrong podcast about independence. It gets exhausting to have to feel like you are supposed to develop both physical and emotional excellence, have none of it appreciated or celebrated, only to realize that in the end, none of it mattered, especially as a woman's emotional state simply changes one day. And I quote, "I gave up on women because I woke up. I'm tired of doing everything wrong. I'm tired of emotional manipulation. I'm tired of being unwelcome in my own house. I'm tired of giving everything that I can and getting little to nothing in return. I've been single for over 5 years now, and I've never been happier." And this brings me to my next point. Most men are invisible to women. It's viewed as a given for men to often do all of the protection, manual labor, provision, as if a man should just do that, where women are rarely asked to provide or perform any sort of utility for their male counterparts. If women screw in an IKEA table, we throw a parade. If men fix the roof or take down an attacker, well, it's something that they should do. And I quote, "I think it's a fact that I could be easily invisible, that unless I make the effort to go out and talk to somebody, or even initiate, nobody will talk to me or even smile at me." And this honestly just breaks my heart. As a personal side note, I'm sorry. And this ultimately leads me to a very important point, which is how much men hold back. Women demand empathy and space for their feelings, but rarely reciprocate in that department. And most men are not direct because most women can't handle direct communication. Men do not express anger for fear of being labeled abusive or invalidating, and men's voices tend to carry more. Thus, men must have more self-control, whereas women are not only encouraged but celebrated for expressing anger or other volatile emotional states. And I quote, "Women don't recognize how much we hold back, as to not hurt them, both physically and emotionally. And we don't do this for other men. It's just for women, because contrary to popular belief, women are indeed delicate, even if they don't act like it." Which brings me to my next point. Words can hurt and leave a scar much longer than bodily wounds. Wounded women go straight for the jugular, especially when they feel scarcity or fear of abandonment. And this is where vulnerabilities get weaponized to push men over the edge. And sometimes women will push men to where it gets physically confrontational, where then women can leverage this and take legal action, or write a victim narrative. Now, I want to personally emphasize the fact here that domestic violence is never okay, nor is it justifiable. But the stories we never hear are the 1,000 emotional paper cuts that lead to the snap. Women know they can't physically overpower a man, so they can take a man's purpose and use it as a dagger instead. A real man would provide for his family. A real man would be able to satisfy me during sex. You'll never make enough money to really provide. My ex was better than you in bed. Our kids deserve a better father than somebody who would talk to me like this after she assaulted a man verbally. And these cases happen more often than you'd think. And no, this isn't just a one-way street, but it is important to acknowledge that this does indeed happen to men. And this brings me to my next point. We are more honest than you think we are. The most common thing that women don't understand men is our outside to inside. Unless the guy is narcissistic or some other personality that makes them feel like they're required to wear a mask or a shield. We are the same all the way through. Men are pretty simple. We want peace, play, and joy. Unlike women, we don't ask 20 questions. We tend to just go straight to the thing if we have a concern. Don't ask, don't get. Men will follow rules if they exist, and we often follow them as law, specifically in a relationship. And this brings me to my next point, which I think is arguably the most important one. Men are not afforded the same time and space to express that women are, and they take that sacrifice willingly. This is a long quote, so I am going to read it. You're in psychology, so obviously you're going to be told all kinds of information about talking about your problems and expressing your emotions. Know this, however, this entire line of thinking is a part of a gynocentric view of mental health. Why are men so bad at these things? Because they're just broken women? Or are men just different? Consider cavemen. What happens when a bear decides your cave looks like a good hibernation spot? He can't break down and cry that he's about to fight a frickin' bear. He doesn't have the time to talk about his feelings of inadequacy to his job, and even if he did, And is his family going to feel confident for him to defend them if he does? No, he simply has to go out and face the bear or predator. Even if he comes back and vents his emotions, meanwhile, one of the other men is giving a primal roar of victory, which man do you think the women and children will feel confident for in the future? Why would the men and women feel confident in you next time if you were so uncertain and scared this time? So the other men who have to work with him will respect him less, ultimately. Men bond over these shared dangers and challenges. If he feels he can't rely on you the next time, well, also, women will be less attracted to him, even if it's not conscious. So even if modern psychology is good for men, as it's good for women, it's not worth the cost, and it seems to be teaching men to become better women. Thousands of years of evolution is not so easily overridden. So what do men need? Time and peace to deal with their emotions internally, or an adequate support system. He needs his woman to tend to his physical and mental wounds without looking down on him, but instead appreciate the sacrifices that he takes on. He needs a woman who builds him up, even if she knows he was likely terrified and potentially still shaken up. He needs her to show confidence in him so that he knows no matter what, she's still loyal to him. Men are willing to sacrifice themselves, but only so long as they get respect, appreciation, and her confidence in him. And he needs her to understand how he felt, even without his need to verbalize it. Ever wonder why women are so emotionally intelligent? This is one of the reasons why women tend to be good at this, while men struggle. Which brings me to my next point. Men and women are different. And here's 21 differences between men and women that you need to understand. And if not, here's one invitation to, respectfully, fuck off.